All right, stage 4 of the French Revolution, 1795 to 1799, the Directory. After the execution of Robespierre, the government that he was elected under, called the National Convention, decided that the Reign of Terror was a terrible, terrible thing, which I think we can all agree that it was, and with the head of the Reign of Terror and the Committee of Public Safety finally deposed of, the National Convention decided to write a new constitution for France. Let's put a new government together that hopefully can do a better job than our government just did. This new government is going to be called the Directory, and France is going to be run by an executive branch with 5 men as a quote-unquote board of directors. So these 5 guys were supposed to be able to run France. There's a legislative branch underneath them that passes laws. They enforce the laws. Everything should be wonderful, happy-go-lucky, awesome in France. The problem with the Directory is it was terrible. The government was extremely weak, and with 5 directors, all with roughly the same amount of power, most of the time, France was basically just a political arena where those 5 men would compete to see who could get more power than the others. So rather than working together, they worked separately and against each other. This quickly led France to fall apart into basically chaos. Bandits basically roam the streets. These are essentially gangs of human beings running around that will use physical force and threats of violence to take money from people to control specific areas of France. And this is because the government couldn't enforce the laws. The government had very low funds, so they had a hard time paying soldiers and paying police officers. The laws that they passed weren't being put into place in the towns outside of Paris and outside of their immediate reach. Many people would simply disobey what the Directory said was the law, and then no one would come to force them to follow the rules the Directory established. So think of France as sort of a chaotic place to be during the reign of the Directory. And all the while, the Directory was ineffective and being ignored. There was this young military officer in the French army who was quickly becoming more and more famous. He became so famous that eventually this Directory is going to see him as an incredible threat to their power. And this young military officer's name is Napoleon Bonaparte. So we'll talk a little bit about him now. When the revolution began in 1789, we talked about our first stage of the French Revolution. Napoleon is a young man in his low 20s who is an artillery officer in the French army, meaning he's the guy that works with and commands the cannons. Napoleon was born on the island of Corsica, which is an island in the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of France and Italy. When he was a young man, his family, who had a little bit of money, sent him to a French military academy in France, where he was educated and trained to become an officer during the army. Napoleon really got his rise to fame during the Revolution. During the Revolution, Napoleon's first real military assignment was to remove British troops from the French town of Toulon. Toulon is on the south coast kind of France, and the British were able to take it over during the chaos of the Revolution. They'd used it as a military base and as an important port for their naval ships. Well, Napoleon was tasked with his artillery section to help remove the British from Toulon. When he was at Toulon, he served there under another general for several months. But all the time that he was serving under this general, Napoleon would have very different ideas on how the general siege of the city should go. Until one day, as Napoleon and this general are walking in the siege camp, they're walking along with their troops, this general's head gets basically shot off with a cannonball right next to Napoleon. Well, when this happened, and he dies almost immediately, Napoleon essentially becomes one of the main leaders of the French military trying to take this city back from the British. Well, Napoleon comes up with this incredible idea of this important mountain that overlooks the city that he believes that they should take over so that the cannons can shoot down at the city, and if the cannons can shoot down at the city, then the British will have nowhere to hide. And essentially, Napoleon's ideas and Napoleon's leadership causes the British in Toulon to surrender and the French to regain control of this important port. So this starts to get the Directory and other people in the French government aware of Napoleon, because look at this young kid with his great ideas. He was able to capture the city that for months before the guy who was supposed to be more experienced and better than him simply couldn't do. So after too long, because of his popularity, because of his skill, Napoleon is actually going to be given control of the French army of Italy, and was tasked with basically defeating the Austrian troops that were in Italy, and taking over Italy for the French Republic, or at least taking over parts of Italy for the French Republic. It was kind of seen as a less important area of Europe where fighting was taking place. The most important armies were up in northern Germany, where a lot of the fighting between the Austrians, the Prussians, and the French were, but Napoleon's given control of Italy and given kind of a small army. Napoleon uses all his resources, all his training, all his sort of incredible intelligence, and he's able to reorganize the army of Italy, which is what the French army in Italy is called, and then use this army to completely and totally conquer Italy for the French Republic. So again, this young kid is given control of an army which is kind of not expected to do very much with, and then within a few months he's conquered an entire part of Europe for the French Republic because of his brilliance, because of his leadership technique. So all the while, I want you to think that while the French are reading about the Reign of Terror, and while the French are reading about the defeats of the French armies in the French territories by the Austrians and Prussians that are in the northern part of France, they're reading the one area of success that France is having is everything this young kid Napoleon does. Everything he does seems to turn to gold, and that's going to help him become even more and more famous in France. After Napoleon's success in Italy, the Directory really started to get nervous about Napoleon maybe making a play to become part of the government himself. He conquered Italy for France, and one of the things that Napoleon did, which is sort of unique, is he signed the peace treaty with the Austrians without consulting the Directory, the government, for what the government thought the terms of the peace treaty should be. So the Directory thought, wow, this kid's willing to make all these decisions by himself and act a little bit like a king himself, where he's not consulting the Directory, which is part of the French Constitution. So it continued to make them nervous, but he's so popular and he's so successful, and the Directory's so weak, the Directory feels like we can't really get rid of him because that might cause him to fight us and we might lose. So what is a strategy that we can come up with to get Napoleon out of the picture so that we, the Directory, can stay in charge? So what the Directory does is actually something that Napoleon has thought up of himself, and the Directory just say, this is a great idea, Napoleon, go for it. In the late 1799, the British control Egypt. Egypt is an important territory for the British to control because it allows the British to trade with their other colony of India very easily. Goods from India can go through Egypt, through the Mediterranean, up to England, and England can make money and sell through Egypt to India. Napoleon figures if the French can conquer Egypt, they can sever the link between India and England, make it very difficult for them to trade, to reinforce each other, and sort of maybe hurt the British Empire in a real significant way. So Napoleon asked the Directory, can I take an army to Egypt to conquer it? And the Directory loves this idea. Let's get Napoleon the heck out of France, out of anywhere near us, get him across the Mediterranean Sea. If he wins there, great. If he dies there, great. Either way, he's not our problem anymore. So, in 1789, his army sails from France to Egypt, and then by 1799, Napoleon had conquered all of Egypt, parts of the Middle East, modern-day Palestine, modern-day Israel, parts of modern-day Syria, and all the way up to parts of modern-day Turkey. So he's incredibly successful, but the whole time that he's successfully conquering parts of the Middle East and Egypt, he is receiving more and more reports from France that the Directory was becoming even weaker, and weaker and weaker. And other countries were again threatening France with an invasion because they saw how weak the Directory was. So realizing that France was in a terrible spot and about to have war declared on it and an invasion happen all across its borders while he was far away in Egypt, Napoleon decides that his potential will be best realized if he can return to France. So basically, in the middle of the night, without really informing his soldiers in Egypt of where he's going, he and a few staffers are going to creep aboard a small French ship that's going to sail home across the Mediterranean Sea. And Napoleon's going to leave one of his officers in charge of the French troops stationed in Egypt. So Napoleon is going to return to Paris. When Napoleon returns to France, he was greeted, says we was greeted, I gotta change that. He was greeted by thousands of cheering French citizens who called on him to save the revolution. Thousands of people came out onto the streets when they found out Napoleon was returning to Paris. They cheered him. Some of them hailed him as king, which he tried to sort of distance himself from, though maybe secretly he was a little excited about this idea. But Napoleon noticed almost as soon as he got there, and so did other important French political figures, realized the Directory was about to collapse, and there's going to be another new government in France if someone doesn't sort of start to figure out the problems that France has. So Napoleon decides, with the support again of other important political figures, that he's going to make his move to take over the entire country. So in November of 1799, Napoleon's supporters, which is basically large amounts of military figures, surrounded the directors and the legislative branch. When they were surrounded, Napoleon's little brother, named Lucien, convinced the legislators that a coup d'etat, a forcible takeover of power, was about to be planned by other people, not the Bonapartes in France, but that the Bonapartes, Napoleon, Lucien, and the other brother Joseph, were going to protect the Directory and the legislators. And Napoleon's little brother, convinced the legislators and the Directory to run out of Paris to a place called Chateau de Saint-Cloud. And at the Chateau de Saint-Cloud, they would be protected there by Napoleon's forces, so that when the coup attempt happened, there would be soldiers there to protect them, and they could defeat the coup and make sure that everyone stayed in power that was already in power. However, when these legislators ran to the Chateau de Saint-Cloud, and they were held up in this house for hours and hours and hours, it did not take them long to realize that maybe the coup that the Bonapartes told them about wasn't actually going to happen. In fact, maybe the real coup was that the Bonapartes had them all trapped in a house, not able to leave or escape. That same day that Lucien, Napoleon's little brother, had all the legislators in this house, sort of trapped or protected, depending on which one you believed at the time, Napoleon went around to 3 of the 5 directors in France and forced them to resign their positions. Once 3 of the 5 directors resigned their positions in the government, Napoleon entered the room where all the legislators were being kept by Lucien. When Napoleon entered the room, many of the legislators, many of the government officials, started to scream at him because, oh my God, this guy is trying to take over the country, and we've just been involved in a revolution to get a republic for 10 straight years where thousands of people have died, and this dude is going to end it and take over the entire freaking country? Like, this is the exact opposite of what we wanted. Some of them decided to throw things at Napoleon or to physically assault him. When Napoleon started to get physically assaulted, Napoleon's little brother again, Lucien, decided that this couldn't happen, and if Napoleon was killed, their whole plan was going to fall apart, and Lucien ordered some of the largest and most powerful of the French troops that were guarding these legislators to go in and force the legislators to leave Napoleon alone and arrest those that could not be controlled. Once the troops ran in and arrested these legislators, it was quickly apparent to everyone there that this was Napoleon attempting to take power. The legislators were then told, at the point of a gun, that they had to give up their power. They had to dissolve their legislative branch the way that other branches during the revolution had dissolved themselves. And then they were forced to sign a paper that said that they agreed that Napoleon and 2 other men should be allowed to draw up a new constitution for France that would replace the Directory. This new constitution from France would claim to be a republican constitution, but Napoleon himself would be called First Consul of the French Republic and have almost entirely absolute power. So at the end of this stage, what I want you to know is Napoleon Bonaparte has forced the government to sign a piece of paper saying that he is essentially now the only person in charge of France.